All right, so this is the fourth and the final section in ultrasound physics. Um, so this this week we're gonna look at dynamic range. We're gonna look at the biologic effects of ultrasound, um, and we'll sort of wrap up everything looking at the biologic effects of ultrasound. So, as I said, when you do your echo, the machine is going to have a bunch of stuff on the side of the machine, and you need to know what these symbols stand for, and you have to know what they mean.
Yeah.
One of the symbols you're going to see is either DR or DNR. Okay, so you also going to see there's going to be something there to tell you the frequency of the probe that you're using.
Yeah.
You're going to see something there that's going to tell you about the resolution. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's something that's going to tell you about the 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 the, the resolution, the frequency. You're going to see DNR or DR, which means dynamic range. You're also going to see something, say MI or TI. That's what we're going to discuss at the end of the lecture. MI is mechanical index, TI or TIS, which is thermal index. So, and they like to test you to make sure you know the settings on the machine, what they stand for.
Yeah.
Okay. The temporal resolution, is very important. Remember, so that's also going to be at the side of the on the machine. Usually on the when you're facing the machine, it's on the right side, but they can put it on any side they want. So you have to know all the when you are using the machine, you have to know everything that's on the machine. Okay, so as mentioned before, you're going to say the frequency of the probe you're using, and the frequency of the probe you're using, unless you're doing vascular or TE, is usually between 2 and 5. So you say 2 to 5 megahertz. The temporal resolution is going to be there, and they usually put the temporal resolution frames per second, or sometimes they just put hertz. They might put 50 frames per second. So that means in 1 second you have 50 frames, as we show you how to work out temporal resolution and stuff like that. And you will also get they'll put something marked dynamic range, which is DR or DNR. And then you might see your MI, which is mechanical index, TIS, which is thermal index in tissue. And we're going to go over all of that. But the important thing is to know everything that's on the machine, you need to know what it stands for. So dynamic range, when you look at the echo, you see these different shades of gray, 50 shades of gray, right? Okay. So there are different shades of gray. And there are the dark gray and then the light gray. So there are different shades of gray. And basically if you have a high dynamic range, it means that you have more shades of gray, 50. All right? And then a low contrast. With a low contrast, you have, with a high dynamic range, we need to talk about a low contrast image. With a low dynamic range, there's smaller difference between the shades of the gray. Okay? And you have a high contrast image. So it's another very good image. So on the machine, on the button in the machine, you're going to see dynamic range. It might have compression or log compression. So those of you who have a holder machine, real whole machine, it's going to say compression. It means the same thing. different shades of gray. So you can vary that shades of gray from the very gray to the lighter gray. Okay, and that will sort of give you the contrast and make your image uh, improve your image. Okay, uh, so say when you look at the older machine, it don't have dynamic range; it has compression, and it's usually logarithmic compression where we have large amplitude. The large amplitudes are compressed, and you amplify you amplify the amplitude signals. So if you look at this example, this dynamic range is 35 decibel, and we usually use decibel to denote the dynamic range. And then the lower one, at higher dynamic range, you see there's not much contrast between the different grays. Okay, there's at the lower dynamic range, you see there's more contrast. You can distinguish the structures more. Okay, so when you say dynamic range, it just means the different shades, and you want to make sure that you can distinguish them. You don't want them to all look alike because the tissue clarity or the image clarity is not going to be very great. Another thing you need to know a little bit about is signal to noise ratio. You want more signal than noise. So whatever you do, you try to improve the signal and reduce the noise. So the signal is the ultrasound wave that you're trying to measure. It's the desirable ultrasound then. So that's what you want to measure, desirable ultrasound. And it affects the image quality. You want as less noise as possible. So the noise is the undesirable ultrasound, the background noise, the interference, so to speak, and that affects image quality. When you're doing a study, you want to get a high signal to noise ratio. You want more signal than noise.
So noise could be like when somebody breathes or so, and you see that voice.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, and then, but not only that, but if there is anything in the background that you don't want, which is coming up prominent, that's noise. Anything. So in this example, you have the amplitude, the frequency, amplitude on the vertical axis, frequency on the horizontal axis, and you see the nice signal. You see the nice signal, sharp signal, and then you see the noise, the background interference that we don't need. If the signal to noise ratio is close, then the image quality is going to be poor. You want a large signal and a low noise. So the second scenario, this signal to noise ratio is pretty close. You have a large signal, but you have a large amount of noise too. Whereas here, you have a fairly decent signal and a low noise. So this is in a crowded room, restaurant. The signal might be high, but the noise is going to be tremendous. And then if we're in a public, if we're in a library where it's quieter, and if you say you're giving some type of instruction, which is a signal, that's what you want to hear. The signal to noise ratio is going to be larger because you have more signal, less noise. Just a rough example. So you want more signal than noise. So a large signal to noise ratio is good because you're having more signal than the noise. And it's usually measured in decibels. Ratio greater than 1:1 indicates more signal than noise because it's signal on top, noise at the bottom. So a ratio greater than 1:1 is desirable. And the signal is usually, what we call power average or voltage average. This is how you measure it. So you don't have to understand the whole mathematics about it. But we can use, when we measure a signal, we can use power or we can use the voltage. When we do voltage, we have to square it to, but don't worry about that. And then the noise basically is measured the same way. So, if we use power to do the signal, if we use power to do the signal to noise ratio, then the average power of the signal, we're going to use that when we see V, that's velocity squared, because in order to get power, square the velocity. And then the noise, same thing. Or you can use voltage. If you use the voltage, use a root mean square voltage. That's how you don't have to know about the mathematics, but you can use power or you can use voltage to get the signal to noise ratio. Okay, and it's measured in decibel. So when you look at the ultrasound machine and you see 10 decibel or whatever signal to noise ratio, okay, and you can adjust that. So a little mathematics. So we use logarithmic. It's on a logarithmic scale, so we're talking about decibels. So if we talk about a signal to noise ratio of 1, then it's really log base 10 to 1. And you get a 0 decibel. So that would be a 0 decibel. But we're not going to spend any time on the maths right there. But so we look at dynamic range, which is just looking at the different shades of gray. Okay, you want to make sure that you can distinguish the image. So you want to make sure that you have a good dynamic range. And compression, the older machine, I said, will have compression. The newer machines will have DR or DNR. And then we talk about the signal to noise ratio. You need more signal than noise. That's basically what that means. And then gain. On the machine, it's not actually on the screen, but it's actually one of the buttons or a series of buttons that you can adjust. And gain is similar to brightness. So if you increase the gain, you increase the brightness. And what it is basically an amplification of the returning signal. So you can amplify the returning signal to make it brighter. Okay? So you can regulate the strength of the echo. If you look at these two examples, the image on the left is not very bright. So you can increase, and you see the lower structures, you're not seeing that clearly, right? So if you're doing an echo and you see something like that, you just increase the gain, increase the brightness. You will see the lower structures better, but it's also going to brighten the upper structures as well. So in this situation, you increase the overall gain, but you could increase just the gain to the lower portion. That would be more ideal. And you have that on the machine. You can do that in the machine. So you can do what is done here and increase the overall gain. So it's going to show you the lower structures, but it's going to brighten the upper structures more. Or you can use what we call the TGC to just increase the gain to the lower portion and leave the upper portion as is. So you have to know what TGC stands for and how to use it. So TGC means time gain compensation, and all you're doing is increasing the gain to just that segment that you need. And when you're scanning today, look at the machine, and you will see that there is a series of buttons that you can increase the gain to just that segment that you want. Okay? So it's time gain compensation, TGC, signal lost from the deeper tissue. So when you're doing any scan, remember what we said, attenuation. You have more attenuation the greater the distance. So the deeper structure are not going to be highlighted as well as the more superficial structures. So once you realize that, then you can increase the signal to the lower portion or the deeper structures. Okay. So what you do is you adjust and compensate for each depth, and that's what those buttons stand for. Each depth you can adjust and compensate the gain. So you can lessen the tissue attenuation with depth, or you can improve the tissue, or lessen the tissue attenuation, improve the image at a greater depth. All right, so if you get an image like that, you say, look at the deeper structure. If you look at the deeper structures, it's not very well highlighted. You have dropout in the interatrial septum, and to the lateral portion of the atrium, there's dropout as well. So you want to increase the gain to those deeper structures, right? So TGC does that. So you just increase the gain to the lower structure without increasing the gain to the upper structure. So you have a uniform image. Time gain compensation, okay? Those are the buttons we're talking about. All right? You must have seen these buttons on the EC and the Echo. Right. So what you do, the deeper structure where you have attenuation because of this depth, you increase the gain. So because you don't want to increase the overall gain, because the structures that are superficial gonna be too bright, right? So so we talk about overall gain, which increasing the brightness, and then TGC just increasing the gain to those areas that you have more attenuation. So it's depth. The more depth, the more attenuation, and you can increase the gain by using a TGC. So ultrasound is very safe. However, where you have rapidly dividing cells, it can cause some problem. Okay? So it's relatively safe, very safe in adults, but in the developing fetus, it can be a problem. And we're going to look at thermal index, which is abbreviated as TI. So when you look at the side of the machine on the screen, you'll see TIS or TIB. Are you going to see MI? Okay. So TI is thermal index. That deal with heat production. And then when you say MI, it's mechanical index. It's the ability to form cavities. So the ultrasound can form cavities. And as a result of that, it can form bubbles, or it can burst bubbles. Okay? So if you remember, ultrasound is a form of mechanical energy. Remember we said that? The energy is proportional to the amplitude. So it's a form of mechanical energy. Remember now, we use ultrasound to break up stones. And it's a treatment modality to break up kidney stones. So, what you're doing there, you're harnessing the mechanical energy of ultrasound and breaking up these stones. So when you do that, you're using much more energy than what we would use in a diagnostic ultrasound test. Okay, so ultrasound is a form of mechanical energy. Um, it penetrates tissues as an oscillating wave of alternating pressure. So you have a large. Remember the sound wave we have, or compression and rarefaction. So when there's compression, there's a high positive pressure, and then when there's rarefaction, there's a very low pressure. That's what it means. So ultrasound sound wave is traveled in compression, rarefaction. So the compression is where you have a high positive pressure. Rarefaction is where you have a high negative pressure. It is the negative pressure which will form bubbles. Okay. So and the pressure, the energy, the mechanical energy is measured in megapascals. Okay. All right. So the factors affecting the hazard potential of ultrasound. So the things that will affect how bad the ultrasound perform is the total acoustic output, or the ultrasound energy. So the amount of energy then. What we say diagnostic ultrasound, we don't use a lot of acoustic output power. But if we're using therapeutic ultrasound, then it's much larger. Um, and so you also have to look at the tissue that you're examining. It is if there's more proteinaceous tissue, then it's more susceptible to the thermal injury, the heat. Okay, the higher the fluid and the gas content, then it's more susceptible to cavitation and formation of bubbles. So more protein, the more heat will affect it. If there is a lot of fluid and gas, then you'll form bubbles or cavitation injury. So, you know, ultrasound is a diagnostic ultrasound of potential uh, harm, but mainly to the developing fetus, because the tissues are rapidly growing, and the conditions are usually just right. Uh, so tissue susceptibility is also one of the hazard potential. Um, Rapidly proliferating tissues such as fetal and embryonic tissue, developing babies tend to run into the problem. Adult tissues have static cell population and hyperemic response. So what does this mean? That in adults, the cells are not growing. They're already finished growing. And then when heat is produced, you get to hyperemic, you can dissipate the heat, not so much in the fetus. And so if you're doing a lot of ultrasound in early pregnancy, you have to be careful. And the type of ultrasound that you use, you have to be aware of that. The more problem with a pulse and continuous wave Doppler ultrasound, as opposed to just your regular two-dimensional ultrasound. So if you're doing fetal work, you have to bear that in mind. You don't want to do a lot of P double and C double. Okay. All right. So other factors affecting the hazard potential, the type of transducer you use. So if the transducer that produce a lot of output power, the depth of penetration, okay? So the more superficial structure, susceptible to more energy. Remember, you have attenuation the further the depth. So anything that's superficial is more susceptible to the energy. And then the overlying layers of tissue. Some overlying tissue can be protective. If it's not protective, then you have damage directly to the underlying tissue. Uh, as mentioned before, Doppler ultrasound can cause significant temperature rise compared to the B mode, M mode, and three-dimensional ultrasound. So you want to limit P double and C double when you're doing fetal work. okay, because they produce more heat. Um, so the mechanical effects, as we said, you know, tissues that have more gas and fluid is more prone to the cavitation effect of ultrasound. Um, and the mechanical effect or cavitation refers to the development of gas bubbles in an acoustic field at high negative pressure. So remember when we said the sound wave causes compression, rarefaction, is the negative pressure is the rarefaction portion that results in bubble formation. So you can create bubbles in the fetus when you doing your scan, especially if you use pulse wave or CW for any long period of time. So you have to bear that in mind. Um, so the mechanical effect is the development of gas bubbles, and what happened, the development of these gas bubbles, you have a vibration at a critical size, and these bubbles grow and collapse, they grow and collapse. Um, and as mentioned before, um, you'll get elevated temperature, and it's the negative pressure that creates these bubbles or cavitation. And when these bubbles collapse, grow the growth and collapse and increase the temperature, they can release free radicals. That's one of the hypotheses, and can cause tissue damage. As I said again, in fetus, not in the adult population. So the injury, we talk about the inertial cavitation with the free radicals that are produced, and you can have, injury. All right. So the takeaway message is that the mechanical effects of the ultrasound is the formation of bubbles, okay, and it can eat up the tissue. And these bubbles, as I say, they constantly increase and decrease, increase and decrease, and they form free radicals, and then these free radicals can cause more damage, mainly in the developing fetus. So not so much in adults. Well, not in adults. So we need something to tell us how much mechanical energy we're transmitting or we're producing. And we have the mechanical index, MI. So when you look at the side of your machine and you see MI, that's what it means. What is the likelihood of forming these bubbles or cavitation? And the definition for that, so it's a safety index. You don't want to go above a certain MI, mechanical index. And it's a safety index, as mentioned before, and it's a likelihood of cavitation events. And it is defined as the peak negative pressure divided by the central frequency or the center frequency. So it's PNP divided by FC. And as I say, it is MI, that's the mechanical index. It is basically the likelihood of cavitation events forming. So if you look closely, you'll see that it's inversely proportional to the frequency. So the greater the frequency, the less your PNP. Okay, the lower the frequency, the greater the greater your MI. Sorry. So the greater the frequency, the lower the MI, mechanical index, and the lower your frequency, the greater the mechanical index. So the FDA recommends that you use a MI less than 1.9 because they think that the risk is minimal if you use MI of less than 1.9. Now, we do microbubbles in ultrasound. We use microbubbles to, if we do a study and it's not very diagnostic, the images are poor, we use microbubbles, and the microbubbles will outline the heart, the cavity, and then we can see the wall. So we can talk about ejection fraction and then wall motion abnormality. So microbubbles in ultrasound or in echo is crucial. But if the MI is too high, you're going to destroy the bubbles. You're not going to see anything. Okay? So when we're doing microbubble study in echo, we want that MI to be much less than 1, not 1.9, but that will destroy our bubbles. So when we inject our microbubbles, if the MI is 1.9, it's just going to look dark because all the bubbles are going to be destroyed. So good exam question is, when doing microbubble study, would you want a high MI or a low MI? You don't want to destroy the bubbles because you want to see what's going on. So you want a low MI, mechanical index. So the mechanical index is defined as PNP divided by square root of FC, where PNP is peak negative pressure. So when the sound wave is moving, you'll have compression, rarefaction. Compression, rarefaction is the rarefaction which gives you the negative pressure. So so it's the peak negative pressure divided by the center frequency, the square root of the center frequency. The FDA recommends less than 1.9. All right. The threshold for capillary injury in animals. So a lot of these studies were done in animals. The threshold for capillary injury in animals is 1 megapascal using a frequency of 2 to 10. So they did a bunch of usually use mice, and they can increase the peak negative pressure, and they can vary the frequency of the transducer and then look under the microscope and see what's going on. So capillary injury in animal, 1 megapascal, 2 to 10 megahertz. And when we're doing ultrasound, you'll see ALARA all the time, or when you're doing any type of diagnostic or CT scan or whatever, you want to as low as reasonably achievable. You don't want to, so once you want to use the lowest possible settings to get the best image. You don't want to crank up everything because then you're going to run into a lot of side effects from the diagnostic study. So while obtaining the best possible diagnostic image, you want to do ALARA as low as reasonably achievable. That's what that means. And those are the institutions that did these work on mechanical index. So on your ultrasound machine, you're going to see MI. That's what it means. And if it's more than 1.9, then you have to adjust it. So you have to know what's on the side of the machine. For the FDA, less than 1.9. So if you go and you see 3, you have to do some adjustments. Okay. All right. So it's basically saying with a high mechanical index, with a high mechanical index, you can get tissue damage. That's basically what that means. With a high mechanical index, you get twisting and spin, the acoustic streaming and torque. So it's just twisting and spinning forces, streaming and fluid, cell distortion, lysis. Lysis means breakdown of the cell. So with a high mechanical index, you can get tissue damage. Then we'll come to thermal index. So thermal means heat. So the ultrasound, a potential side effect is destruction of the cells, right? High mechanical index, destroying the cell cavitation formation. You can also produce heat, and that's called the thermal index. And on your machine, you'll see TI. So the thermal index, the definition, you have to know that. The thermal index is an indication of temperature elevation that's going on. And the definition is the acoustic power used to the acoustic power used to the power. So it's a ratio. So it's a ratio. Okay, any index is a ratio. So it's acoustic power used to the power required to produce a rising temperature of 1 degrees Celsius. So any index is a ratio. So it's the power that you're using, the acoustic power used, to the power that's required to raise the temperature 1 degree Celsius. That is the definition. And we have 3 subdivisions of thermal index. We have thermal index soft tissue, TIS, thermal index bone, and thermal index adult cranial. Most of your machine will have TIS or TIB, the thermal index. That is basically temperature elevation that you will get from the study. So you have to know the classic definition. It's a ratio. There's a power that you're going to use to the power that's required to elevate the temperature. All right. So basically what we're saying is that the sound energy is converted to heat. Okay? The sound energy is converted to heat, and of course heat is teratogenic, so it can cause injury in the developing fetus. So your mechanical index, the cavitation potential of ultrasound, and heat is mainly fetal, rapidly growing tissues. So it's mainly in the fetus. So, so if it produces heat, it can destroy or damage the developing fetus. And temperature rise should be kept below 1.5 degrees Celsius when you're doing fetal work. Try and keep the temperature rise above 1.5.
So does it matter how long?
Right. So it is a lot of time. It's a time thing. So if you do if you're doing fetal work and you spend an hour,
yeah,
you increase the chance of heat production and mechanical injury. Okay. And then if you use Doppler as opposed to 2D, then you increase the chance of heat production and mechanical injury even more. And so most of the work, because it affects fetus, most of the work is done by obstetrician and gynecologists. And this table look at the thermal index and the maximum exposure. So the question to your question, Arthur. So if you look at an embryo or fetus, the minimum recommended exposure times for to get a thermal index of 0.7, you need an exposure time of 60 minutes. And then if you're spending less time, then the exposure time. Let's see. That's maximum recommended exposure time for the embryo fetus. All right. So basically, what this is saying is, if the thermal index, if you look at if your machine is set at say 2, if the thermal index in the machine is set at 2, you want to limit the exposure time because that's a much higher thermal index. You want to limit it to 4 minutes. But you can reduce that on the machine. If you reduce your TI on the machine to 0.7, then you can scan for as long as 60 minutes. So if you do fetal work, you will use a lower TI so you can scan longer. Because if you use a TI of 2, you only have 4 minutes. And if you can't get all your images and in that time, then all right, this didn't project very well, but this looks at the things that affect the thermal index, the acoustic output. If you're going to use Doppler as opposed to 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 just your 2D images, so you can just read this over. Most of the stuff that we discuss is in this paper. Um, so that's basically most of the stuff that you need for ultrasound physics. We still have to do artifacts, and we will set a time where we'll probably spend one session on artifacts, because if you're doing a scan, you should know what is real from what's not real, because sometimes these artifacts can look like a mass of thrombus in the heart, and you have to know what maneuver to perform to determine whether this is a true structure or is it an artifact. So ultrasound physics is not that bad, right?
You didn't get these slides.
Yeah, we haven't
Set
used
you
it
there.
since game.
Yeah,
We don't
yeah,
have these
yeah.
slides.
All right, we'll make sure you get the biologic the slides for biologic effects.
I'm sending it now.
I'm sending it now.